Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, over the past several weeks, as we've had this extraordinary uprising for racial justice in our society, I've gotten a question and a reaction from various people across the Jewish community. And that question can be summed up in the following way. Is the act of Jewish people saying Black Lives Matter kosher? In other words, is that an acceptable thing for Jewish people to be saying, given the fact, and this is a legitimate fact, that the leadership in the Black Lives Matter movement a few years ago issued very harsh statements about Israel? And you know what? That's a very legitimate concern, especially considering the fact that this seems to happen over and over again, doesn't it? That Israel gets held to standards that other countries don't get held to, and which of course is really just a way of being anti-Semitic and drag as anti-Israel sentiment. And we see this in radical left perspectives. In the BDS movement, we see it on college campuses. And indeed, we see this anti-Semitic, anti-Israel bias amongst several voices in leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's tragic because it is people who are on this radical left who are exploiting the intersection between the suffering of Black people in the systemic racism of this country and the suffering of Palestinians in the very different situation that's existing in Israel. They're exploiting that and fueling the fire of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism among some in the Black Lives Matter movement. So indeed, it even took the form of the movement coming out publicly and calling Israel an apartheid state and coming out officially in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. That's rough stuff. That's very difficult for all of us as Jewish people who love the state of Israel. Nevertheless, I'm going to come out and say something perhaps controversial. With all of that acknowledged, it is still absolutely important for all of us as Jewish people to stand tall and proud, and through our actions and in our words, to proclaim that Black lives matter. And I'm going to explain why. In this week's Parsha, as I mentioned before, it's the story of the spies and how the spies scout out the land and they come out and they see, or they claim to have seen, all kinds of terrifying things that strike fear into the hearts of the Israelites. And God is enraged and God wants to wipe out the Jewish people, and Moses intercedes. And then we have this very interesting, in fact, I'm going to share screen because I actually want you to look at the verses here. Here we go. Everybody see that? When we look at the text, this command comes out of the Parsha. If you unwittingly fail to observe any one of the commandments that the Lord has declared to Moses, anything that the Lord has enjoined upon you through Moses, from the day the Lord gave the commandment and on through the ages. So, all right, so obviously God is threatening us that if we transgress even one of the commandments. The problem with this text that you're looking at is it's a poor translation of the Hebrew. If you fail to observe any one of the commandments, that's what it says. But if you look at the Hebrew, V'chi tishgu v'lo ta'asu et kol hamitzvot ha'ela. What does et kol hamitzvot ha'ela mean? It means if you fail to observe all of these mitzvot, then that will incur the wrath of God. It's an interesting mistranslation, and it doesn't seem to be a mistake that it says all the mitzvot, because if you compare it to a parallel text in the book of Leviticus, if the whole community erred and the matter escapes the notice of the congregation, so that they do any of the things which by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done. And if you look here, it says, V'asu achat mikol mitzvot Adonai. Here it says all of the mitzvot. So here in our Parsha, it seems to be very clearly stating that the Israelites can transgress all of the commandments. So why is that being put forth? In what way can we possibly, as a nation, transgress all of the commandments? And the Chama Leibowitz does a very powerful exploration of this. And she looks at what the Israelites said after the matter of the spies. All of the Israelites railed against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in the land of Egypt, the whole community shouted at them. Or if only we might die in this wilderness. Why is the Lord taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be carried off. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt. And they said to one another, let us head back for Egypt. So they're giving up, right? If you just read, they're giving up on the whole thing. So on its surface, even that seems to be a transgressing of everything. And even more specifically, there's this Hebrew, which was translated, let us head back for Egypt. Nitna rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayim. What does nitna rosh mean? Well, there's many explanations of that phrase. It means direct our head, like just in English, like when we head back to something, right? It can certainly translate as it says here. But if you look at Rashi, he gives other translations, right? Nitna rosh, let us make a captain, right? Understanding this as the Targum does. Let us appoint a chief, that is, let us set a king over us. But our rabbis explain the word rosh to denote idol worship. So, okay, so now we have three definitions. One is let's head back to Egypt. Let's appoint a new king instead of Moses. Or the other one is let's just start bowing down to idols. So however you slice it, any one of those three things is really, really bad. In other words, it's tantamount to betraying all of the commandments simultaneously. And how is it that we manage to do that? Well, it's actually quite disturbing how we managed to do that. There was this small but very powerful and loud group of leaders who scouted out the land and then twisted what they saw in Israel. They twisted their report of Israel, thus striking terror and fear and mistrust and a desire of all of the Israelites to turn away from their mission. Right? So both the spies and all of the Israelites were guilty of the same sin. They wanted to betray their mission that God freed them from slavery for in the first place. And that is tantamount to transgressing all of the commandments. Now here we have the story. These Israelites just witnessed this unbelievable deliverance from slavery. They saw the signs and the wonders. They're right at the edge of the land of Israel, of the promised land. And yes, you know, the spies weren't wrong about this. It's tough in Israel. There's difficult situations ahead. It's going to be very painful. That's correct. But at the same time, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And just as Joshua and Caleb said, we can surely do this. We can do this. But instead of trusting that they were doing what was right in the eyes of God, they listened to those loud, few leaders who were distorting the truth. They listened to them and their hearts turned away from all of the mitzvot in that moment. There's a very powerful lesson in this to apply to this moment in history as the Jewish people and the rising of Black Lives Matter in this moment in time. Yes, 5 years ago, there were very loud and powerful leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of them are still there. And they inserted this plank in the manifesto that is a profound and twisted distortion of what's happening in Israel right now. That is true. There's also truth in it. That's important for us to recognize too. But because of the deep distortion going on, there are some Jews who feel like maybe we should turn away from the ultimate meaning and message of the movement of Black Lives Matter. We must learn the message of Parshat Shlach Lecha. In 1939, the government of Chamberlain in England published the now famous White Paper. And the White Paper was the document that promised a home, a nation, for the Palestinian Arabs who were living in what was then Palestine. And this was a deep setback for the Zionists, who had been proceeding, especially since the Balfour Declaration in 1917, on creating a then promised Jewish state in the land of Palestine at the time. But 1939 was an infamous year in many other ways as well, wasn't it? 1939 was the year that Hitler invaded Poland, that the scourge of Nazism and the Holocaust was spreading across Europe and threatening the whole world. And England was at war with Nazi Germany. And so the Jews who were struggling for a Jewish state had a choice now. Do we fight with England, even though England now is promising a land not to the Jewish people? And it was at that moment that Ben-Gurion said his very famous statement. He said, "We will fight the white paper as if there is no war, and we will fight the war as if there is no white paper." In other words, Ben-Gurion showed true moral leadership at that moment in history. Yes, we are fighting for the Jewish state. We are fighting for the right of the Jewish people to have their homeland. And we are fighting for a much higher cause for all humanity as well, which is equal to that cause. And that cause is against the scourge of an evil of Nazism and the destruction of the Jewish people. That's what moral leadership is all about, folks. Sometimes we have to do what is uncomfortable for us. There are times in history when we have to stand with those who would in other circumstances be our adversaries for the sake of the world. There are times, even as we struggle for the best of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, that we must overcome our fear and do what is right for all humanity by sowing unity instead of disunity of all humankind. This act of saying Black Lives Matter is particularly important for the Jewish people because the meaning of that statement is so profound. It outweighs those on the radical left who are twisting anti-Israel sentiment, who are twisting the intersection of Black and Palestinian suffering into a weapon against Jews. It is so much more important than that, this truth. To stand together with all humanity and to say Black Lives Matter. It is particularly important as the Jewish people, given who we are and our history, to say Black Lives Matter. If we are indeed to be a people of tzedek, of justice and holiness in the world. Because Lord knows if the tables were turned, and they have been turned, as they were turned in Nazi Germany, we would want all people in the world to stand up and say Jewish lives matter. Even if there are Jews who are bigots, even if there are Jews who seek to do terrible and even evil things in the world, nevertheless, all of us who are good people would want the whole world to stand up as we did, and they didn't, to say Jewish lives matter. Black people in America and around the world deserve nothing less. 3,000 years ago, our people learned this incredibly important and painful lesson, that you can't give up on what is good and right and true because of the twisted ideas and reports of some leaders with power. Because to do that is to betray our essential mission as the Jewish people in the world. So yes, in our time, we will fight against anti-Zionists and anti-Semites with every bit of force and passion and love of the Jewish people and of humanity that we can. And we will fight for the dignity and rights of people who are Black and people of color in this society and the world. Because only in this way can we truly fulfill our mission to teach the world that all humankind is created, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. We do this by teaching that indeed what we mean by tikkun olam, by repairing this whole world, is by asserting strongly and proudly and unequivocally, Black Lives Matter.